When Flaxborough's bank manager dies smiling at a charity exhibition, Inspector Purbright discovers that tea-time poison and charitable fraud make perfect partners in this quintessentially English murder mystery. Good evening, mystery lovers. Before we dive into Inspector Purbright's latest case, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? The Flaxborough Corn Exchange had endured many indignities in its time. Political rallies that ended in fisticuffs, amateur dramatics that tested the very limits of human patience, and wedding receptions where the bride's family discovered unfortunate truths about the grooms. But it had seldom been asked to accommodate quite so much concentrated respectability as the Ladies Civic Circle autumn exhibition demanded. The building seemed to sag slightly under the weight of good intentions, prize-winning preserves, and the sort of determined cheerfulness that could flatten lesser structures entirely. Mrs. Walter Creake, whose authority in matters of civic improvement was rivaled only by her capacity for finding fault with other people's efforts, surveyed the assembled displays with the practiced eye of a general inspecting troops she suspected of harboring deserters. The trestle tables groaned under their burden of Victoria sponges, each labelled with the sort of careful penmanship that suggested its creator took the business of cake-making as seriously as international diplomacy. Garlands of paper chrysanthemums drooped from the rafters like exhausted bunting, while beneath them the town's horticultural elite had arranged their dahlias in formations that would have impressed a parade ground sergeant. At the far end of the hall, positioned with what the committee had optimistically described as strategic prominence, sat Mr. Aubrey Creake, manager of the Midland and Rural Bank. The deck chair in which he had installed himself, borrowed from the Amateur Dramatic Society's production of Seaside Follies, creaked ominously under his substantial frame, but showed no immediate signs of surrender. Mr. Creake was not a man typically associated with leisure activities. His idea of relaxation generally involved calculating compound interest, and his presence at community events was usually limited to those occasions when his professional standing required a show of civic engagement. Yet there he sat, hands folded across his considerable waistcoat, wearing an expression of such profound contentment that several committee members had remarked upon it. It was not the tight-lipped smile of professional courtesy that Mr. Creake normally deployed at public gatherings, nor the grimace of barely concealed impatience that usually accompanied his attendance at civic functions. This was something altogether different, a broad, beatific grin that suggested he had just heard the punchline to an exceptionally amusing joke, one that perhaps only he was in a position to appreciate. Mrs. Prunella Fallow, whose Damson Preserve had secured first prize largely through the simple expedient of discouraging all other entries, paused in her circuit of the hall to observe the banker's unusual demeanour. "How pleasant," she murmured to Mrs. Creake, "to see Mr. Creake entering into the spirit of things." Mrs. Creake sniffed delicately. "He's entering into something," she replied, "though whether it's the spirit of civic duty or something rather stronger remains to be seen." The observation proved more prescient than either lady could have anticipated. When Mrs. Fallow approached Mr. Creake to inquire whether he was enjoying the exhibition, her polite inquiry received no response. A gentle touch to his wrist revealed why this might be so. The flesh was quite cold, and Mr. Creake's beatific smile had acquired the fixed quality that suggested it would remain in place for considerably longer than social convention typically required. Mrs. Fallow's subsequent exclamation, a sound that combined surprise, alarm, and a faint note of social embarrassment at having discovered a dead banker in such public circumstances, cut through the genteel murmur of the exhibition like a fire bell through a library reading room. The small brass ensemble on the balcony, which had been working its way through a medley of patriotic airs with more enthusiasm than accuracy, faltered and fell silent. In the sudden quiet that followed, the assembled worthies of Flaxborough turned their attention to the far end of the hall, where Mrs. Fallow stood frozen beside Mr. Creake's chair like a woman who had just realized she was part of a tableau she had never auditioned for. Mr. Lancelot Dorn of Dorn & Sons, funeral directors, stepped forward with the measured tread of a man whose professional expertise was suddenly, if unexpectedly, relevant. His examination was brief but conclusive. "I'm afraid," he announced in the hushed tones appropriate to such pronouncements, "that we shall need to summon the police." "Not the doctor?" inquired Mrs. Snetter, whose faith in medical intervention remained touchingly optimistic despite considerable evidence to the contrary. "The police, Mr." Dorn repeated firmly, and there was something in his voice that suggested the distinction was significant. Inspector Walter Purbright arrived within the quarter hour, accompanied by Sergeant Love and trailing an air of quiet competence that seemed to settle over the agitated committee members like a mild sedative. He was a tall, spare man whose unremarkable appearance concealed a mind that found human nature endlessly fascinating, if not always entirely comprehensible. He approached Mr. Creake's chair with the unhurried attention of someone examining an interesting but not entirely unexpected phenomenon. "He is indeed smiling," Purbright observed mildly, as if commenting on the weather. His pale eyes took in the scene with methodical care, the position of the chair, the arrangement of nearby exhibits, the small crowd of witnesses who had managed to maintain a respectful distance while ensuring they missed nothing of significance. "Who discovered him?" he asked. "I did," Mrs. Fallow replied, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested the discovery had not been entirely welcome. "I merely thought to inquire whether he was enjoying the exhibition. He looked so, peaceful." "Quite so," Purbright agreed. "And so he does." He paused, studying the banker's expression with the detached interest of a portrait critic. Had Mr. Creake seemed unwell earlier? Distressed in any way? The question prompted a small chorus of denials. Mr. Creake had appeared, by all accounts, to be in excellent spirits. Indeed, rather better spirits than anyone could recall seeing him display in recent memory. He had arrived during the cake judging, had accepted a cup of tea brought to him by young Dolly Rudd from the refreshment table, and had settled into his borrowed chair with every appearance of a man prepared to enjoy an afternoon's entertainment. "The tea," Purbright said thoughtfully. "Who paid for it?" "Mr. Morton Flagg," supplied Mrs. Snetter, with the prompt accuracy of someone who kept careful track of all financial transactions, however minor. "He said it would be neighborly to show that the bank still had friends in the community." Purbright's eyebrows rose fractionally at this information. Morton Flagg owned the florist shop on High Street and had recently been engaged in what the local gossips delicately termed discussions with the bank regarding the rearrangement of certain financial obligations. That he should choose to demonstrate his goodwill through the purchase of tea for the bank manager struck the inspector as worthy of note, though he kept this observation to himself. Dr. Holmes' arrival and subsequent examination confirmed what Mr. Dorn's professional experience had already suggested. Mr. Creake was quite thoroughly dead, and had been so for some time, certainly since before the jam judging had commenced. The cause of death would require further investigation, though the doctor's preliminary assessment suggested that nature had received some form of assistance in reaching its conclusion. As the hall was cleared and the various officials went about their necessary business, Inspector Purbright found himself returning repeatedly to the question of Mr. Creake's extraordinary smile. In his considerable experience with the deceased, he had rarely encountered such an expression of satisfaction. It was the smile of a man who had just solved a particularly vexing puzzle, or perhaps discovered that his suspicions regarding a long-standing mystery had been entirely correct. The question, of course, was what sort of puzzle might have prompted such satisfaction in a man like Aubrey Creake, and whether the solution had proved quite as amusing to everyone involved as it apparently had to him. "Sergeant," Purbright said quietly, as the last of the committee members were ushered from the hall, "I think we shall want to have a word with young Miss Rudd about that cup of tea. And perhaps Mr. Flagg might be persuaded to elaborate on his recent neighborly impulses." Sergeant Love nodded, making careful notes in his book. And the smile, sir. People seem rather unsettled by it. People, Purbright replied, are unaccustomed to seeing bankers look quite so pleased with themselves. It suggests they may have discovered something rather more profitable than the usual rate of interest. He paused, glancing once more at the empty chair. The question, of course, is whether the profit was entirely legitimate, and whether everyone involved in the transaction is equally satisfied with the arrangement. Outside, Flaxborough resumed its customary rhythms, though the afternoon's events had already begun to work their way into the town's vast network of gossip and speculation. By evening, the story would have acquired embellishments, contradictions, and theories that would keep the local population entertained for weeks. Inspector Purbright, however, was less interested in the town's collective imagination than in the specific circumstances that had left Aubrey Creake smiling like a man who had just heard the world's most amusing secret, and who would never have the opportunity to share the joke with anyone else. By the time the Corn Exchange had been cleared of its bewildered committee members and restored to something approaching municipal dignity, the first tendrils of gossip had already begun their inevitable journey through Flaxborough's well-established channels of communication. Inspector Purbright, however, was less interested in the town's collective imagination than in the more prosaic details that surrounded Mr. Creake's final afternoon. He found Dolly Rudd in the annex behind the main hall, where she was methodically washing teacups with the sort of concentrated attention that suggested she was grateful to have something useful to occupy her hands. Dolly was a thin, bright-eyed girl whose eagerness to please had the slightly desperate quality of someone who had learned early that being helpful was often the safest course of action in an unpredictable world. "You served, mister." "Creake his tea," Purbright observed, settling himself on a nearby chair with the unhurried manner that encouraged confidences. "Yes, sir. Mr. Flagg said he'd treat everyone, and Mr. Creake was sitting closest to the refreshment table. Dolly's hands continued their careful work with the crockery as she spoke. He handed me a 10-shilling note and said to start with, "Our friend over there," meaning Mr. Creake, because he looked rather parched. "Start with," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. "So, Mr. Creake received the first cup from the fresh pot?" "That's right, sir. I carried 2 cups on the tray, one for him and one for Mrs. Snetter, who'd been hovering by the urn like a sentry. Mr. Creake was very polite about it. Said, 'Thank you, my dear,' and mentioned he didn't take sugar. I'd already put the lumps in, so I fished them out with the spoon." She paused, a small smile crossing her features. "He actually laughed when I did that. I remember thinking it was odd. You never see Mr. Creake laugh in the bank. And the spoon? Left it on his saucer, sir. I meant to collect it later, but there was such a crowd around his chair after Mrs. Fallow made her discovery." Purbright made a mental note regarding the spoon's whereabouts and thanked Dolly for her cooperation. Sergeant Love, who possessed an unerring ability to locate tradesmen during their business hours, had already tracked down Morton Flagg to his flower shop on High Street, where he was engaged in the melancholy task of arranging dahlias that had clearly seen better days. "Inspector," Flagg greeted him with a sort of excessive heartiness that immediately suggested a guilty conscience. Terrible business about poor Creake. One tries to extend a friendly gesture, and fate decides to make it memorable for all the wrong reasons. "You were feeling particularly neighborly this afternoon," Purbright observed mildly. "Purchasing refreshments for fellow citizens." A small gesture, nothing more. Mr. Creake and I had been having discussions, professional discussions, about my account. There seemed to be a possibility of reaching a new arrangement. I thought it might be appropriate to demonstrate that there were no hard feelings. "An arrangement regarding your overdraft." Flagg's smile became slightly strained. "My financial obligations, yes." He'd been rather stern about the matter initially, but there had been a softening in his attitude recently. We were to sign the papers on Monday morning. He seemed almost human about the whole thing. Did you speak with him directly this afternoon?" I nodded when I paid for the teas. He looked up and gave me the most extraordinary grin, as if I'd just told him the most amusing joke imaginable. Quite unlike his usual manner, I must say. Mr. Creake has never found me particularly entertaining. As Purbright made his way back through the town centre, he became aware that news of the banker's demise was spreading with remarkable efficiency. At Meadows and Son, grocers, the story had already acquired embellishments that would have impressed a novelist. Mrs. Bertram Meadows was informing her customers that Mr. Creake had been discovered clutching a mysterious document, while at Twining's Hardware, the prevailing theory involved empty bottles and a celebration that had proved fatal. It was near the War Memorial that Inspector Purbright encountered Mrs. Cynthia Bottomley, a formidable woman whose nephew Gerald worked as a clerk at the Midland and Rural Bank. Mrs. Bottomley had the determined air of someone who considered herself entitled to official information, and she intercepted the inspector with the efficiency of a practiced interrogator. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself as the town's unofficial liaison with law enforcement, "I trust you'll be looking into Mr. Creake's recent activities. There have been irregularities." "Indeed," Purbright replied, pausing with the patient courtesy that had served him well in extracting information from reluctant witnesses. "Financial irregularities," Mrs. Bottomley replied with evident satisfaction. "My nephew Gerald mentioned that Mr. Creake had been staying late at the bank rather frequently, examining accounts that weren't part of his usual responsibilities, acting like a man who had discovered something that pleased him enormously." This intelligence struck Purbright as potentially significant. "And when did Gerald first notice this change in Mr. Creake's habits?" "Just after the harvest festival, when all that unpleasantness with the church accounts came to light. Gerald thinks Mr. Creake may have been conducting his own investigation into certain financial discrepancies." Mrs. Bottomley lowered her voice conspiratorially. The accounts that seemed to interest him most were those of the Ladies Civic Circle and the Autumn Exhibition Fund. Gerald said he spent an entire evening going through those records, making notes and looking like a cat who had discovered an unguarded fishmonger's shop. As Purbright continued his walk, this new information began to arrange itself into a pattern that was both intriguing and troubling. A bank manager investigating financial irregularities connected to the very organization whose exhibition had provided the setting for his death was the sort of coincidence that, in his experience, rarely proved to be coincidental. The question was whether Mr. Creake's investigation had uncovered something genuinely significant, or whether his satisfaction had stemmed from an entirely different source. By evening, the various threads of gossip had woven themselves into a tapestry of speculation that would have challenged the imagination of the town's most creative residents. Yet beneath the rumors and theories, certain facts remained constant. Aubrey Creake had died wearing an expression of profound satisfaction. He had been investigating accounts connected to the Ladies Civic Circle, and someone had felt moved to purchase him a cup of tea on what proved to be the last afternoon of his life. Inspector Purbright, reviewing these facts in the quiet of his office, found himself returning repeatedly to the question of timing. The convergence of Mr. Creake's investigation, the autumn exhibition, and Morton Flagg's sudden display of neighborly generosity suggested a choreography that was either remarkably coincidental or remarkably deliberate. The challenge, as always, would be determining which possibility represented the truth, and whether that truth was something that someone in Flaxborough had been willing to kill to protect. The following morning brought one of those deceptively serene October days when Flaxborough wore its mask of provincial respectability with particular conviction. Inspector Purbright arrived at the Midland and Rural Bank as the clock struck 9, accompanied by Sergeant Love and the sort of official documentation that rendered even the most reluctant witnesses suddenly cooperative. The bank's modest premises exhaled an air of careful probity, though recent events had introduced an undercurrent of unease that no amount of polished brass could entirely dispel. Gerald Bottomley proved to be a pale, anxious young man whose resemblance to his formidable aunt was mercifully confined to a shared tendency toward precise articulation and an unfortunate habit of wringing his hands when nervous. He led them through the bank's cramped quarters to Mr. Creake's office, where filing cabinets stood open like accusatory mouths, their contents bearing witness to recent and thorough investigation. Mr. Fumble. Creake had been working rather late, Gerald confirmed, his voice carrying the hushed reverence appropriate to discussing the recently deceased. He said he was conducting a routine audit of community accounts, but his manner suggested something rather more significant. He seemed to be looking for something specific, and I believe he found it. The account ledgers, when produced, revealed a pattern of transactions that was both perfectly legitimate and subtly peculiar. The Ladies Civic Circle maintained dual accounts, one for operational expenses and another designated for charitable disbursements. Money flowed between these accounts with clockwork regularity, always properly documented and duly authorized by the appropriate signatories. Here, Gerald said, indicating several entries marked with Mr. Creake's distinctive question marks, donations from anonymous benefactors, followed within days by charitable disbursements of slightly smaller amounts. The pattern repeats monthly, though the sums vary. Mr. Creake found it amusing. Amusing? Purbright inquired mildly. He laughed, sir, actually laughed, which was so extraordinary that I knocked to inquire whether everything was satisfactory. He said something about the value of well-placed butterfingers and asked me to fetch additional records from the strongbox. Then he sat there, grinning like a man who'd just solved a puzzle that had been vexing him for months. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Home, whose post-mortem findings had prompted an urgent consultation. The doctor's usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by professional gravity that suggested his discoveries had been neither routine nor pleasant. Digitalis poisoning, Doctor. Home announced without preamble. Quite a substantial dose, administered within 2 hours of death. The curious thing is that Mr. Creake appears to have recognized what was happening to him. His expression suggests he found the situation rather ironic, as if he appreciated the elegance of the method. This revelation cast the banker's beatific smile in an entirely new light. If Mr. Creake had indeed recognized his predicament, his expression of satisfaction suggested either remarkable philosophical acceptance or the knowledge that his death would accomplish something he considered worthwhile. Returning to the Corn Exchange, Purbright found Mr. Runcorn, the caretaker, engaged in the melancholy task of restoring order to the scene of yesterday's festivities. The refreshment area had been tidied with characteristic efficiency, though certain details remained to tell their story. The tea things were collected promptly, Runcorn explained. Mrs. Ball. Crick supervised the washing up herself, very particular about it. Though we seem to have mislaid a spoon, the operatic societies always borrowing cutlery and forgetting to return it. Which spoon specifically? Purbright asked. The one young Dolly left on Mr. Creake's saucer. Mrs. Crick mentioned it particularly, said it would be needed for the inventory. As they prepared to leave, Purbright reflected on the morning's revelations. The Ladies Civic Circle accounts displayed patterns that had aroused professional suspicion. Mr. Creake had discovered something that amused him enormously, and someone had administered a fatal dose of digitalis with sufficient subtlety to ensure the victim's cooperation. The missing spoon, the charitable account irregularities, and the banker's final smile were beginning to form a pattern that was both elegant and disturbing. The afternoon would bring conversations with Mrs. Crick and Mrs. Fallow, and perhaps some clarity regarding the true nature of the charitable activities that had so entertained the late Mr. Creake. In Flaxborough, Purbright had learned, the most respectable façades often concealed the most creative forms of misbehavior, and the most obvious explanations frequently proved to be the most elusive. The afternoon brought Inspector Purbright to Mrs. Vesta Crick's residence, a dwelling that seemed to have been arranged by someone who viewed domestic disorder as a personal failing. Mrs. Crick received him in her sitting room, where the furniture appeared to have been positioned with military precision, and the very air seemed to have been disciplined into respectability. She offered tea with the sort of gracious authority that suggested refusal would constitute a breach of civic duty. "A most regrettable business," Mrs. Crick declared, settling herself behind the tea service with practiced command. Poor Mr. Creake was not a man one associated with public spectacles, particularly not of such a terminal nature. He was always most particular about maintaining proper appearances. Purbright accepted his cup with appropriate gratitude, while allowing his gaze to wander over the assembled photographs of civic ceremonies and committee meetings that adorned the mantelpiece like military honors. "You supervised the clearing of the refreshment area yesterday, I understand. Most thorough of you. Standards must be maintained, Inspector. The Corn Exchange belongs to the community, and we return it in better condition than we found it, or attempt to." Her expression darkened slightly. "Though I confess we seem to have mislaid one of the teaspoons. Young Dolly mentioned she'd left it on Mr. Creake's saucer after removing those sugar lumps, but it had quite vanished by the time we collected the crockery." "The Operatic Society, perhaps?" Mrs. Crick's sniff conveyed volumes about the Operatic Society's relationship with borrowed cutlery. "They have a regrettable tendency to appropriate items for their productions and forget to return them. Though I searched most carefully, such items are inventoried, you understand?" "Your charitable accounts," Purbright observed mildly, producing the ledger entries that had so amused the late Mr. Creake. Mr. Creake had developed a particular interest in these anonymous donations. Mrs. Crick's composure remained intact, though something flickered behind her eyes like a curtain being adjusted. "Perfectly legitimate transactions, Inspector. We receive donations from individuals who prefer their philanthropy to remain discreet, a common enough practice. These funds are then distributed to worthy causes, with appropriate allowances for administrative expenses." Mr. Creake found something entertaining about the arrangement. "Mr. Creake," Mrs. Crick replied with careful precision, "had developed rather cynical views about human generosity. He seemed to suspect impropriety where none existed. At our last committee meeting, he made several pointed remarks about charity beginning at home and questioned how someone with such modest means could display such a generous spirit." Her voice carried the slight edge of someone who had been personally affronted. "Quite inappropriate, really." This revelation struck Purbright as potentially significant, though he allowed no indication of this to disturb his expression of polite interest. He was referring to someone specific. I assumed he meant the circle in general, though his manner suggested otherwise. He seemed to find the entire situation rather amusing, as if he had discovered something that entertained him enormously. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Prunella Fallow, whose entrance carried the dramatic flair of someone who had discovered that finding a body conferred a certain social distinction. Her account of the previous day's events had clearly been refined through multiple retellings, acquiring theatrical embellishments that would have impressed a seasoned performer. "He was positioned most deliberately," Mrs. Fallow declared, settling herself with evident relish into the narrative. "Not merely sitting, you understand, but observing. His chair commanded an excellent view of our committee table, where we keep the account books during exhibitions." He was leaning forward slightly, as if watching something that held his particular interest. "The account books were visible from his position?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Fallow confirmed. "Mrs. Crick always keeps them accessible during events. People sometimes wish to make additional donations or inquire about our activities. Mr. Creake had been studying our operations with the sort of attention one usually reserves for theatrical performances." As the interview concluded, Purbright reflected on the emerging pattern. Mr. Creake had positioned himself to observe the Ladies Civic Circle's financial activities, had made pointed remarks about charitable generosity exceeding apparent means, and had died wearing the expression of someone who had just solved a particularly satisfying puzzle. The missing spoon suggested that someone had been concerned about evidence, while Mrs. Crick's defensive responses indicated that the banker's suspicions might have had substantial foundation. Sergeant Love was waiting outside with intelligence that added another layer to the developing picture. "I've been to Flagg's shop, sir." Found an empty bottle in his back room. Chemist's label mostly peeled away, but the adhesive residue suggests it once contained digitalis drops. Flagg claims it came with a crate of supplies. Says he reuses glass for plant sprays. Mr. Flagg's explanations have been notably comprehensive, Purbright observed. What of his financial arrangements with the bank? Due for renegotiation Monday morning, sir. Flagg admits he was hoping Mr. Creake might show latitude regarding his overdraft. Says that's why he offered to pay for the refreshments. A gesture of goodwill. Goodwill that extended to requesting that Mr. Creake received the first cup from the fresh pot. Precisely, sir. Though Flagg maintains he was simply being neighborly. As they walked through the town centre, Purbright considered the various threads that were beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. The charitable account irregularities suggested that someone had been using the Ladies Civic Circle as a vehicle for personal financial benefit, while Mr. Creake's investigation had apparently uncovered evidence of this deception. The question was whether his death had been intended to silence him permanently, or whether it represented something more complex, perhaps the elimination of someone whose knowledge had become inconvenient to multiple parties. The missing spoon, the empty digitalis bottle, and the careful timing of events suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond simple panic. Someone had planned Mr. Creake's death with considerable care, ensuring that it occurred in full view of the community whose secrets he had apparently discovered. The challenge now would be determining which of Flaxborough's respectable citizens had felt sufficiently threatened by the banker's knowledge to arrange his permanent silence, and whether they had acted alone or as part of a more elaborate conspiracy. In Flaxborough, Purbright had learned, the most innocent activities often concealed the most ingenious deceptions, and the most obvious suspects frequently proved to be the most elusive. The investigation was beginning to reveal the sort of layered complexity that the town seemed to specialize in producing, where charitable good works and civic responsibility provided convenient cover for more personal forms of enterprise. The morning brought Chief Constable Chubb's telephone call, delivered with the brisk authority of a man who believed that unsolved murders reflected poorly on administrative efficiency. There had been, he explained, a delegation of concerned councillors who felt that Mr. Creake's demise was attracting the sort of attention that might discourage visitors during the autumn tourist season. Morton Flagg appears to satisfy all requirements, Chubb declared with evident satisfaction. Motive, means, and a regrettable tendency toward financial embarrassment. The councillors feel he would make an entirely suitable arrest. I should hate to inconvenience the wrong florist, Purbright replied mildly. It tends to have a withering effect on civic flower arrangements. The chief constable's response suggested that he found such considerations secondary to the demands of public confidence, though he grudgingly allowed that accuracy in these matters was preferable to enthusiasm. Inspector Purbright found Morton Flagg arranging chrysanthemums with the sort of theatrical concentration that suggested he was aware of being observed. The florist's usual cheerfulness had acquired a brittle quality, like paint applied over rust, in the hope that no one would examine the surface too closely. You'll have heard about my unfortunate bottle, Flagg began before Purbright could speak. Empty containers can be remarkably compromising when someone dies at an inconvenient moment. Indeed they can. You mentioned it was used for horticultural purposes. My prize petunias suffer from a delicate constitution. Rather like elderly dowagers, they require careful attention to thrive. A diluted digitalis solution, applied judiciously, acts as a remarkable tonic. Quite harmless when properly administered, though I understand the concentrated form can be rather more dramatic in its effects. Purbright noted the slight tremor in Flagg's hands as he spoke, though whether this indicated guilt or merely the natural anxiety of a man whose financial future hung in the balance remained unclear. Your arrangement with Mr. Creake was to be finalized this week? Monday morning, yes. We'd reached a preliminary understanding about restructuring my obligations. Rather ironic, really. His death has left me at the mercy of bank policies that are considerably less flexible than Mr. Creake had become. Flagg's expression suggested genuine regret, though whether for the banker's demise or his own predicament was difficult to determine. You requested that Miss Rudd serve Mr. Creake first from the fresh pot. A courtesy to someone who looked rather parched, though I confess I was occupied with Mrs. Creake at the time. She'd cornered me about wreaths for Remembrance Sunday. One doesn't easily escape such conversations. This detail struck Purbright as potentially significant. If Flagg had indeed been engaged with Mrs. Creake during the tea service, his opportunity to tamper with Mr. Creake's cup became considerably more limited. Dead bankers, as Purbright reflected, were notably unhelpful when it came to renegotiating loans, which suggested that Flagg's motive might be less compelling than it initially appeared. Returning to the station, Sergeant Love produced the previous day's refuse, carefully preserved by the civic-minded Mr. Runcorn. Among the string and biscuit crumbs was a congealed mass of sugar lumps, welded together by dampness into an unappetizing monument to tea-time waste. Miss Rudd mentioned fishing sugar from Mr. Creake's cup, Purbright observed, studying the sticky amalgamation. The question is whether these represent those particular lumps, or whether they found their way into someone else's refreshment. Unlikely, sir, Love replied. Most people would have noticed sugar that had been swimming in someone else's tea. Quite so, which suggests that the digitalis was administered through some other means, possibly the missing spoon itself if it had been prepared in advance. Young Gerald Bottomley's arrival interrupted their contemplation of the evidence. He appeared in a state of considerable agitation, clutching an envelope as if it contained something potentially explosive. I found something in Mr. Creake's desk, Gerald announced without preamble. Hidden behind the drawer mechanism where no casual search would discover it. I believe it explains what he found so amusing. The envelope contained photocopied bank records that revealed the true sophistication of the scheme Mr. Creake had uncovered. Anonymous donations to the Ladies Civic Circle were being matched by corresponding withdrawals from accounts belonging to individuals who had no apparent connection to charitable activities. The money entered through one door, acquired the respectable patina of philanthropy, then emerged through another as legitimate disbursements to fictitious recipients. It's rather elegant, Purbright observed, studying the carefully annotated figures. Money laundering disguised as civic virtue. Mr. Creake had identified the pattern and traced several of the false identities being used for the disbursement accounts. Among the highlighted entries was a notation in the banker's precise handwriting. VC, Butterfingers with the carbon copies. The observation was accompanied by a small sketch of a smiling face, suggesting that Mr. Creake had found someone's carelessness particularly entertaining. Butterfingers, Purbright repeated thoughtfully. Gerald, did Mr. Creake explain what sort of mistake had exposed the scheme? He mentioned that someone had been too clever for their own good, sir. Said the smallest errors often revealed the largest deceptions, and that whoever was running the operation had left traces that a careful examination would inevitably uncover. As the afternoon wore on, the investigation's focus began to shift from the simple question of who had killed Mr. Creake to the more complex matter of why his death had been necessary. The banker had clearly discovered evidence of systematic fraud operating under the respectable façade of charitable activity. but his murder suggested that exposure posed a threat to someone whose position in the community made scandal particularly dangerous. The missing spoon had acquired new significance in this context, not merely as the vehicle for administering poison, but as evidence that someone had possessed sufficient presence of mind to remove incriminating evidence even while surrounded by witnesses. This suggested either remarkable composure or careful planning, both of which pointed towards someone whose involvement in the afternoon's events had been neither accidental nor impulsive. Inspector Purbright found himself returning repeatedly to Mr. Creake's final smile, that expression of profound satisfaction that had so unsettled the exhibition's attendees. The banker had died, knowing that he had solved a puzzle that had challenged his professional expertise, but his satisfaction had proven literally fatal. Someone had recognized that his knowledge posed an unacceptable threat and had acted with calculated precision to ensure his permanent silence. The question now was which of Flaxborough's respectable citizens had possessed both the sophistication to organize such an elaborate fraud and the desperation to commit murder to protect it. In a town where charitable good works provided convenient cover for personal enterprise, the intersection of financial acumen, social respectability, and access to the Ladies Civic Circle's operations pointed toward a surprisingly limited number of suspects, each of whom would have compelling reasons to ensure that Mr. Creake's discoveries remained permanently confidential. The following morning found Inspector Purbright in the committee room of the Corn Exchange, where the Ladies Civic Circle's financial records lay spread before him like evidence at a particularly genteel court-martial. The ledgers exhaled the faint scent of respectability and careful penmanship, though recent events had introduced an undercurrent of suspicion that no amount of neat columns could entirely dispel. Mrs. Creake presided over the delivery of documents with the resigned dignity of someone surrendering family heirlooms to creditors, while Miss Ivy Smeaton, the easy treasurer, hovered nearby with the anxious attention of a librarian watching someone handle rare manuscripts with insufficiently clean hands. The receipt books were produced with ceremonial reluctance, each pad representing months of meticulous record-keeping that had apparently been less meticulous than its creators had intended. Purbright examined the carbon paper with the methodical care of someone who understood that the smallest details often revealed the largest deceptions. Running his thumb along the edges of the receipt pad, he noted that several carbon sheets were missing, a detail that might have escaped casual notice but struck him as potentially significant. "The carbon copies," he observed mildly, lifting the second pad to reveal the shallow indentations left by previous entries. "Most useful for maintaining accurate records." "We are most particular about documentation," Mrs. Creake replied, though her voice carried a slight edge that suggested the topic was not entirely welcome. "Every transaction must be properly recorded and verified." Purbright produced a soft pencil and began the delicate process of revealing the ghostly impressions left on the pad's surface. Like a photographer developing film, the graphite slowly brought forth the shadows of previous entries, addresses that seemed oddly familiar, names that carried the faint echo of recognition, amounts that corresponded to the anonymous donations that had so intrigued the late Mr. Creake. "Butterfingers," he murmured, studying one particularly clear impression. Mr. Creake mentioned something about Butterfingers with the carbon copies. Mrs. Creake's composure remained intact, though something flickered behind her eyes, like a curtain being hastily adjusted. "Administrative errors occur, Inspector. Even the most careful procedures occasionally produce imperfect results. A misaligned carbon sheet, a momentary lapse in concentration, such things are inevitable in any complex operation." The revealed impressions told a different story. The carbon paper had captured evidence of a sophisticated system where donations appeared to be recorded, while the actual financial transactions followed an entirely different path. Anonymous benefactors made contributions that were immediately matched by disbursements to recipients whose addresses, Purbright suspected, would prove to be either vacant or entirely fictional. His subsequent visit to the post office confirmed these suspicions. Mr. Edgar Finch, whose encyclopedic knowledge of Flaxborough's postal arrangements rivaled that of the Domesday Book, examined the list of charitable recipients with the sort of professional interest that suggested immediate recognition. "Dead letters, Inspector," Finch announced with evident satisfaction. "Half these addresses belong to properties demolished for the bypass construction, while the others correspond to residents who departed this mortal coil some months ago. The Hartwell family emigrated to Australia 2 years past, and Mrs. Pemberton's cottage was razed to make way for the new roundabout. This intelligence cast Mrs. Crick's charitable activities in an entirely new light. The anonymous donations were being laundered through fictitious recipients, creating the appearance of legitimate charitable disbursement, while the funds were quietly redirected to purposes that bore no resemblance to civic virtue. Purbright's contemplation of these revelations was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Percy Shales from the Operatic Society, a gentleman whose nervous courtesy suggested he viewed any contact with law enforcement as potentially catastrophic to his social standing. He carried a carefully wrapped parcel that he placed on the desk as if it might contain something explosive. "The missing teaspoon, Inspector," Shales announced with evident relief. "Found in our prop hamper after last night's rehearsal. Mrs. Packby discovered it when sorting the cutlery for next month's production of The Yeoman of the Guard. I thought it best to return it through official channels rather than risk any misunderstanding. The spoon, when unwrapped, proved unremarkable except for a faint discoloration in the bowl and a polish that suggested recent and thorough cleaning." Purbright held it beneath the light, noting the careful attention someone had paid to removing any traces of its recent employment. "Your prop requirements include teaspoons?" he inquired. "For stage business involving refreshments," Shales explained apologetically. "Though we use empty cups naturally, actual tea can be treacherous during dramatic moments. The spoon provides verisimilitude without the risk of genuine spillage." As the afternoon progressed, the various elements of the case began to arrange themselves into a pattern that was both elegant and disturbing. Mrs. Crick's position as chairwoman of the Ladies Civic Circle had provided her with unquestioned authority over charitable funds, while her reputation for administrative precision had deflected suspicion from her creative approach to financial management. The missing carbon copies, the fictitious recipients, and the carefully cleaned teaspoon suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond simple opportunism. The question that remained was whether Mrs. Crick had recognized that Mr. Creake's investigation posed a mortal threat to her carefully constructed scheme, and whether she had possessed sufficient presence of mind to eliminate that threat while surrounded by witnesses. The banker's final smile suggested that he had indeed understood the elegance of the deception he had uncovered, though his satisfaction had proven literally fatal. Returning to Mrs. Crick's residence for a second interview, Purbright found her in her study, surrounded by the accumulated documentation of years of civic service. The room bore the weight of unassailable respectability, though recent events had introduced subtle cracks in the façade that no amount of careful arrangement could entirely conceal. "Inspector," she greeted him with the sort of determined cheerfulness that suggested she had been preparing for this conversation. "I trust you found our records satisfactory. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards of financial accountability." "Indeed," Purbright replied, settling into the indicated chair. "Though Mr. Creake seems to have discovered some interesting discrepancies in your carbon paper system. Something about butterfingers, I believe he mentioned." Mrs. Crick's hands moved to adjust an already perfectly aligned stack of papers, the gesture betraying a nervousness that her voice carefully concealed. Mr. Creake had developed rather obsessive tendencies regarding minor administrative variations. "A misaligned carbon sheet hardly constitutes evidence of impropriety, Inspector." "Quite so," Purbright agreed mildly. "Though when such misalignments occur with suspicious regularity, They begin to suggest a pattern rather than mere carelessness. Mr. Creake appears to have found these patterns rather entertaining, sufficiently so that someone felt moved to ensure his permanent silence on the matter. The interview concluded with Mrs. Creake maintaining her position that any irregularities in the charitable accounts represented minor administrative lapses rather than systematic deception. However, her defensive responses and careful choice of words suggested that she understood the precarious nature of her situation. As evening approached, Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the remarkable sophistication of the scheme that had operated under Flaxborough's collective nose for nearly 2 years. The combination of charitable respectability, administrative authority, and creative bookkeeping had created the perfect vehicle for systematic fraud, while the natural deference accorded to civic volunteers had protected the operation from casual scrutiny. The challenge now would be determining whether Mrs. Creake had acted alone or whether the money laundering operation had involved other members of the community. The scale of the deception suggested organizational capabilities that might have required assistance, while the careful timing of Mr. Creake's death indicated planning that could have benefited from inside knowledge of his investigation. The missing spoon, the doctored carbon copies, and the fictitious charitable recipients had provided the means, opportunity, and motive for murder. What remained was to determine whether Mrs. Creake's butterfingers with the administrative details had been equally revealing when it came to the more serious matter of eliminating inconvenient witnesses. In Flaxborough, Purbright reflected, the most respectable façades often concealed the most creative forms of criminal enterprise, and the most obvious explanations frequently proved to be merely the beginning of more complex revelations. The following morning brought Mrs. Snetter to the police station in a state of considerable agitation, clutching her handbag as if it contained evidence of international conspiracy. She had, she explained with characteristic precision, spent the night wrestling with civic duty and personal loyalty, and civic duty had emerged victorious. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I'm afraid I may have been less than entirely forthcoming about the tea arrangements. Mrs. Creake was unusually particular about the selection of cups and saucers, examining each piece with what struck me as excessive attention to detail. Purbright settled her into the interview room with patient courtesy, noting that Mrs. Snetter's usual composure had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone who had reached a difficult decision. Her subsequent account revealed that Mrs. Creake had personally selected which cup would be served to Mr. Creake, ostensibly because certain pieces had hairline cracks that required careful handling. She also spent considerable time polishing the teaspoons individually, Mrs. Snetter continued, consulting her notebook with scholarly precision. Arranging them in a specific order and handling them with surgical gloves, she claimed were necessary for proper hygiene. I remember thinking it rather excessive attention to cutlery. This intelligence suggested premeditation that went far beyond opportunistic poisoning, though Purbright's contemplation of its implications was interrupted by an urgent telephone call from Mr. Lancelot Dorn. The funeral director's voice carried the sort of careful restraint that suggested professional dignity had been compromised in ways that demanded immediate attention. "If you could step round, Inspector," Mr. Dorn said with deliberate precision. "There has been a small irregularity regarding our late friend's arrangements. Someone has been rather too helpful in paying their respects." The funeral parlor's premises exhaled their customary air of beeswax and discretion, though Mr. Dorn's demeanor suggested that recent events had introduced complications that no amount of professional dignity could entirely address. He led Purbright not to the chapel of rest, but to his office, where he produced the visitor's register with the manner of someone presenting evidence of trespass. "We had a caller this afternoon," he explained. "A lady, well-dressed and veiled, who requested a few minutes alone with the deceased. I'm not in the habit of refusing reasonable requests of that nature, though I confess her subsequent behavior was rather less reasonable than anticipated." Mr. Creake had arrived at the funeral parlor with a small folded paper tucked in his inner waistcoat pocket, a detail Mr. Dorn had noted for the inventory of personal effects. Following the mysterious visitor's departure, both the paper and the lady had vanished, leaving only a signature in the register that proved remarkably enlightening. Mrs. E. Hartwell, Purbright read aloud, studying the careful left-slanted handwriting. One of your fictitious charitable recipients, unless I'm much mistaken. Precisely so, Inspector. The hand was deliberate, the blotting careful, and she left behind the faint scent of Parma violet, old-fashioned and distinctive. This second incident cast the investigation in an entirely different light. Someone had felt compelled to risk exposure by retrieving evidence from the dead man's possession, using the identity of a non-existent charity recipient to mask their activities. The sophistication suggested involvement by someone intimately familiar with the fraudulent scheme's details. Purbright's subsequent inquiries revealed additional complications that challenged his initial assumptions. Mrs. Fallow, whose prize-winning damson preserve had dominated the exhibition's culinary displays, had apparently offered Mr. Creake a tasting spoon of her creation shortly after he received his tea. The preserve's strong, sweet-tart flavor would have been perfectly capable of masking Digitalis's bitter taste, while Mrs. Fallow's position as the person who discovered the body provided convenient cover for removing evidence. Remarkably potent, Mrs. Snetter recalled Mr. Creake saying after sampling the preserve, followed by that extraordinary broadening of his smile. He seemed to find something particularly amusing about Mrs. Fallow's offering. As evening approached, Inspector Purbright reflected on the case's evolving complexity. Mrs. Creake's financial fraud provided clear motive for eliminating Mr. Creake, while the funeral parlor incident suggested accomplices willing to risk exposure for crucial evidence. Yet Mrs. Fallow's preserve offered an equally plausible delivery method for the poison, complicated by her role as the supposed discoverer of the crime. The investigation had reached that delicate point, where accumulated evidence began suggesting multiple possibilities rather than a single solution. In Flaxborough, Purbright had learned the most obvious explanations frequently concealed more intricate deceptions, while the most respectable citizens often proved capable of the most creative criminal collaborations. The missing paper, the fictitious signature, and the prize-winning preserve had introduced new variables that would require careful consideration. Someone in Flaxborough possessed both the sophistication to orchestrate systematic fraud and the desperation to commit murder protecting it, though determining whether this represented one person's comprehensive criminality or multiple parties' collaborative guilt remained the investigation's central challenge. Clutching her handbag as if it contained evidence of international conspiracy, she explained with characteristic precision, spent the night wrestling with civic duty and personal loyalty, and civic duty had emerged victorious. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I'm afraid I may have been less than entirely forthcoming about the tea arrangements." Mrs. Creake was unusually particular about the selection of cups and saucers, examining each piece with what struck me as excessive attention to detail. Purbright settled her into the interview room with patient courtesy, noting that Mrs. Snetter's usual composure had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone who had reached a difficult decision. Her subsequent account revealed that Mrs. Creake had personally selected which cup would be served to Mr. Creake, ostensibly because certain pieces had hairline cracks that required careful handling. She also spent considerable time polishing the teaspoons individually. Mrs. Snetter continued, consulting her notebook with scholarly precision, arranging them in a specific order and handling them with what she claimed were surgical gloves necessary for proper hygiene. I remember thinking it rather excessive attention to cutlery. Even for Mrs. Creake, this intelligence suggested premeditation that went far beyond opportunistic poisoning. Inspector Purbright thanked Mrs. Snetter for her civic-minded honesty and set out to verify the implications of her observations through the sort of methodical inquiry that had served him well in previous investigations. His first stop was Wilkes and Son, chemists, where Mr. Wilkes maintained the sort of comprehensive records that reflected both professional pride and natural curiosity about his neighbor's pharmaceutical requirements. The ledger revealed that digitalis moved through Flaxborough under two respectable banners: horticultural preparations for ambitious gardeners and prescription drops for elderly hearts requiring chemical encouragement. Mr. Flagg purchased a bottle 3 weeks past, Wilkes confirmed, adjusting his spectacles with the care of someone handling valuable evidence. Asked quite sensible questions about dilution rates, struck me as a conscientious gardener rather than someone with darker intentions, though I confess one can never be entirely certain about people's secondary applications for pharmaceutical preparations. The chemist's finger moved down the page to another entry that proved equally illuminating. Miss Ivy Smeaton collects digitalis drops monthly for her bedridden aunt, a lady with an irregular heart and, by all accounts, an irregular temper. Miss Smeaton is most punctual about the prescription, though she always seems rather embarrassed by the transaction. Purbright noted this information with the careful attention it deserved. Two legitimate sources of digitalis within the Ladies Civic Circle suggested either remarkable coincidence or careful planning by someone familiar with the community's pharmaceutical habits. His subsequent inquiry at Hargest's drapery revealed additional complexities regarding the funeral parlor visitor's identity. Mr. Hargest, whose memory for ladies' preferences exceeded his recollection of his own inventory, identified 3 regular purchasers of Parma violet scent: Mrs. Fallow, who claimed it reminded her of her departed mother; Mrs. Creake, who bought bottles for the Circle's charitable gift baskets; and Miss Smeaton, who requested the smallest available size and blushed when other customers entered during her purchases. Old-fashioned fragrance, Hargest observed, with the authority of someone who had witnessed changing tastes for 3 decades. Not many young ladies favor such traditional scents these days. Those who do tend to be either sentimental about family connections or deliberately cultivating a particular impression. Returning to Mr. Dorn's establishment, Purbright found the funeral director eager to provide additional details about his mysterious visitor. The lady had worn gloves of an old-fashioned cut, stitched along the back in a style that suggested either inherited accessories or deliberate attention to period authenticity. Her handwriting in the visitor's register leaned distinctly leftward, creating letters that appeared to retreat from the reader's examination. Most deliberate in her movements, Dorn recalled, knew precisely where to look for what she sought, suggesting familiarity with Mr. Creake's habits or advanced knowledge of where he kept important documents. The entire visit lasted less than 5 minutes, but she accomplished her purpose with remarkable efficiency. As afternoon approached, Purbright found himself contemplating the elegant choreography that had surrounded Mr. Creake's final day. Mrs. Creake's unusual attention to the tea service, the multiple sources of digitalis within the Circle's membership, and the carefully planned retrieval of evidence from the deceased's pocket suggested coordination that went beyond individual desperation. His interview with Mrs. Fallow regarding her prize-winning preserve revealed the final piece of the delivery mechanism. The damson's intense flavor would indeed have masked digitalis effectively, while her innocent offer of a tasting spoon provided perfect cover for administering poison. More significantly, Mrs. Fallow revealed that she had used sugar supplied through Mrs. Creake's bulk purchasing arrangements for Circle members. Most economical, Mrs. Fallow explained with evident satisfaction. Mrs. Creake arranged favorable terms with a wholesale establishment, though I confess the sugar seemed rather more processed than my usual supplier's product. Still, one cannot argue with the savings, and Mrs. Creake assured us it was perfectly suitable for preserving purposes. The implications were clear: Mrs. Creake's position as coordinator of bulk purchases, had provided her with the opportunity to ensure that certain ingredients contained substances beyond their advertised contents. The preserve had been prepared with contaminated sugar, making Mrs. Fallow an unwitting accomplice in the banker's murder. As evening settled over Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright reflected on the remarkable sophistication of the scheme he had uncovered. The charitable fraud had provided both motive and cover for murder, while the community's natural deference to civic volunteers had protected the operation from casual scrutiny. Mrs. Creake's authority within the Ladies Civic Circle had given her access to funds, supplies, and social positioning that made both systematic theft and calculated murder not merely possible, but almost inevitable. The missing spoon, the doctored sugar, and the funeral parlor intrusion represented not separate crimes, but components of a comprehensive plan to eliminate Mr. Creake and destroy evidence of his discoveries. The banker's final smile had been that of a man who appreciated the elegant irony of his situation, discovering fraud only to become its ultimate victim through methods that demonstrated the same attention to detail that had exposed the original deception. The investigation had reached that critical point where accumulated evidence began forming a coherent picture of premeditated murder disguised as community service. In Flaxborough, Purbright had learned, the most respectable façades often concealed the most creative forms of criminal enterprise, and the most obvious explanations frequently proved to be merely the surface of more elaborate deceptions. Tomorrow would bring the delicate task of confronting Mrs. Creake with evidence that her butter fingers with administrative details had extended to considerably more serious matters than misaligned carbon copies. The challenge would be determining whether her comprehensive criminality represented individual initiative or coordination with accomplices equally committed to maintaining Flaxborough's reputation for civic virtue at any cost. The following morning found Inspector Purbright in his office, studying the accumulated evidence with the methodical attention of someone preparing for a particularly delicate confrontation. The various threads of the investigation had woven themselves into a pattern that was both elegant and damning, revealing a sophistication that went far beyond simple financial irregularity. Flaxborough, he reflected, possessed a remarkable capacity for transforming civic virtue into criminal enterprise, where the most respectable façades often concealed the most creative forms of deception. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Ivy Smeaton, whose usual nervous composure had been replaced by the determined air of someone who had wrestled with conscience and found duty the victor. She carried a small leather portfolio that she placed on his desk with the careful precision of someone handling potentially explosive materials. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying the slight tremor of someone about to betray a confidence, "I believe I may have information relevant to your investigation. Information that I should have provided earlier, though I confess I hoped it might prove irrelevant to the more serious matters at hand." The portfolio contained correspondence that revealed the true sophistication of the charitable fraud's organizational structure. Letters from fictitious recipients thanking the Circle for their generosity, complete with forged signatures and return addresses that corresponded to the demolished properties Mr. Finch had identified. More significantly, the letters were written in 3 distinct hands, suggesting that the scheme had required multiple participants to maintain its convincing façade. "Mrs. Creake asked me to assist with correspondence," Miss Smeaton explained, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She said the volume of thank-you letters had become overwhelming and that it would be appropriate for the treasurer to handle some of the administrative burden. I thought it was merely efficient delegation of charitable responsibilities. Purbright examined the letters with growing interest, noting how each hand revealed different levels of comfort with deception. Miss Smeaton's contributions displayed the careful uncertainty of someone following detailed instructions, while Mrs. Creake's showed the assured penmanship of someone comfortable with creative documentation. The third hand, however, proved most illuminating. Elegant, left-slanted script that matched perfectly with the signature in Mr. Dawn's visitor's register. Mrs. Fallow, Miss Smeaton confirmed with evident reluctance when Purbright indicated the samples. She said her experience with prize competition entries had given her expertise in creating compelling written presentations. I assumed she meant testimonial letters, not fabricated correspondence from non-existent beneficiaries. This revelation cast the entire investigation in sharp relief. Mrs. Fallow's discovery of Mr. Creake's body had appeared to be unfortunate coincidence, but her participation in the fraudulent correspondence identified her as the mysterious funeral parlor visitor who had retrieved crucial evidence from the deceased banker's pocket. The preserve, the poison delivery system, the careful positioning to discover the body, all components of a comprehensive plan executed with remarkable coordination. Purbright leaned back, considering the elegant choreography that had surrounded Mr. Creake's final afternoon. The banker had been eliminated not through individual desperation, but through collaborative planning that demonstrated the same attention to detail that had made the charitable fraud so successful. Mrs. Creake had provided organizational leadership and access to funds. Miss Smeaton had contributed administrative legitimacy through her treasurer's position, while Mrs. Fallow had supplied literary creativity and, ultimately, the means of delivering poison through her prize-winning preserve, prepared with Mrs. Creake's specially enhanced sugar. "Miss Smeaton," Purbright said mildly, "I believe we shall need to arrange a small gathering of the Ladies Civic Circle. Nothing dramatic, you understand. Merely an opportunity to discuss certain administrative irregularities that have come to light during our investigation." As Miss Smeaton departed, Purbright turned his attention to the delicate matter of exposing collaborative criminality without creating unnecessary sensation. The challenge lay not merely in proving guilt, but in revealing truth in a manner that honored Flaxborough's preference for understated resolution over dramatic confrontation. He telephoned Mr. Dawn to arrange for Mr. Creake to lie briefly in the chapel with certain personal effects restored to his pocket, including a sealed envelope bearing the discreet legend "To be opened by the bank's auditors." A small test, perhaps, but one that might prove illuminating regarding which party felt most urgently compelled to prevent further investigation. The afternoon would bring the careful orchestration of revelation, where accumulated evidence would be presented with the sort of quiet authority that made denial both futile and undignified. In Flaxborough, Purbright had learned, the most effective confrontations were those that allowed the guilty parties to recognize the inevitability of exposure while maintaining sufficient dignity to confess with grace rather than resist with desperation. The banker's final smile had been that of a man who appreciated the ironic elegance of his discovery. Charitable virtue concealing systematic criminality, civic cooperation facilitating collaborative murder. His satisfaction had proven literally fatal, but his investigation would ultimately expose the remarkable creativity that respectable citizens could display when their carefully constructed façades were threatened with professional scrutiny. Mr. Dawn's telephone call arrived precisely at 9, delivered with the composed urgency of a funeral director who disliked theatrical surprises in his establishment. The chapel had received another visitor, the same veiled lady, he believed, though this time Constable Keedy had been positioned with the discretion of a floral arrangement near the chapel's entrance. She had approached the coffin with practiced efficiency, her gloved hand moving toward the envelope Purbright had so carefully positioned, only to withdraw when she discovered its contents were not what she had expected. "She dropped this in her haste," Dawn reported, producing a handkerchief that carried the unmistakable scent of Parma violet, along with a faint stain the color of damson preserve. "Left through the side entrance with considerable urgency, I'm afraid." By noon, the committee room of the Corn Exchange had gathered its principal ornaments with the sort of resigned dignity that suggested the participants understood this would be their final performance. Mrs. Creake occupied her customary position at the head of the table, her composure intact, though something had shifted, behind her eyes like curtains being adjusted for an unwelcome view. Mrs. Fallow arranged herself with theatrical precision, while Miss Smeaton perched near the door with the nervous attention of someone prepared to flee in either direction. Inspector Purbright began with the methodical courtesy that had served him well in previous investigations, laying out the evidence with the careful attention of someone arranging pieces of a particularly complex puzzle. The carbon paper impressions, the fictitious addresses, the forged correspondence. Each element was presented with understated authority that made denial both futile and undignified. The scheme displayed remarkable sophistication, he observed mildly, studying the accumulated documentation. Anonymous donations flowing through charitable accounts to recipients who existed only in correspondence, while the actual funds were redirected through creative bookkeeping that would have impressed a professional accountant. Mrs. Creake's response carried the defensive precision of someone whose administrative pride had been questioned. Minor irregularities occur in any complex operation, Inspector. We maintained scrupulous records of all legitimate transactions. Indeed, Purbright agreed, though Mr. Creake found certain patterns rather entertaining. His notation about butter fingers with the carbon copies suggested someone had been less careful than they imagined. He indicated the revealed impressions that had exposed the true nature of the charitable disbursements. The smallest oversights often prove most illuminating. The handkerchief was introduced with appropriate ceremony, its combined evidence of Parma violet and damson preserve creating a silence that spoke more eloquently than any accusation. Mrs. Fallow's theatrical composure wavered as Purbright explained how the funeral parlor visit had been necessitated by the need to retrieve evidence from Mr. Creake's pocket, evidence that might have exposed the full extent of their collaborative enterprise. The preserve provided an elegant delivery method, Purbright continued, his voice maintaining its characteristic mildness. Strong flavor-masking digitalis, administered by someone whose subsequent discovery of the body would deflect rather than attract suspicion. Mrs. Creake's bulk purchasing arrangements ensured the necessary ingredients were properly enhanced, while Mrs. Fallow's literary skills created convincing correspondence from grateful recipients who had never existed. Miss Smeaton's confession came first, delivered in barely audible whispers that carried the weight of genuine remorse. She had believed, she explained, that they were merely borrowing against future donations, that the administrative irregularities would eventually be corrected through increased community generosity. Mrs. Fallow's admission followed, her voice carrying the bitter note of someone whose creative efforts had been insufficiently appreciated. The scheme had evolved beyond their control, she claimed, transforming minor conveniences into major criminality through the inexorable logic of self-preservation. Mrs. Creake's acknowledgement came last, delivered with the organizational clarity that had characterized both her charitable work and her criminal enterprise. "If there must be scandal," she said finally, adjusting the papers before her with characteristic precision, "let it at least be conducted with appropriate dignity." Inspector Purbright nodded, recognizing that in Flaxborough, even confession required proper procedural attention. The Ladies Civic Circle had discovered that the same skills that made legitimate charitable work successful could be applied with equal effectiveness to systematic fraud and collaborative murder. Mr. Creake's final smile had been that of a man who appreciated such ironic elegance, though his satisfaction had proven literally fatal when that knowledge became inconvenient to those whose reputations depended upon maintaining appearances. The committee room's atmosphere had acquired the subdued dignity that Flaxborough reserved for occasions when scandal required proper administrative attention. Inspector Purbright arranged the evidence with methodical care. The polished teaspoon, the handkerchief bearing traces of Parma violet and damson preserve, and the carbon paper impressions that had revealed the true nature of charitable enterprise. Mr. Creake was not killed by his tea. Purbright began with characteristic mildness, addressing the assembled officials and the three ladies who had transformed civic virtue into criminal conspiracy. The digitalis was administered through Mrs. Fallow's tasting spoon of prize-winning preserve, prepared with sugar that Mrs. Creake had thoughtfully enhanced through her bulk purchasing arrangements. Mrs. Creake maintained her composure with the organizational dignity that had characterized both her legitimate and illegitimate enterprises. "If we must discuss irregularities," she said with careful precision, "let us at least conduct the conversation with appropriate decorum." The Circle's activities began as temporary adjustments to cash flow, nothing more ambitious than creative accounting during periods when personal obligations exceeded immediate resources. Her confession was delivered with the same methodical attention she had applied to charitable bookkeeping. The anonymous donations had provided convenient flexibility, while the fictitious recipients had allowed funds to be redirected through channels that bore little resemblance to traditional philanthropy. Mr. Creake's investigation had threatened to expose not merely financial irregularity, but systematic fraud operating under the most respectable of façades. Mrs. Fallow's admission carried the theatrical weight of someone whose creative talents had been applied to purposes she had never entirely anticipated. He was already smiling when I offered the preserve, she explained, her voice carrying genuine regret. Sitting there with that extraordinary expression of satisfaction, as if he had just solved a particularly amusing puzzle. I realized he had discovered our arrangement and found it entertaining rather than criminal. Miss Smeaton's testimony revealed the bewilderment of someone who had followed instructions without fully comprehending their implications. Her role as treasurer had provided legitimacy to transactions she had assumed were merely administrative conveniences, while her aunt's digitalis prescription had supplied the means for more permanent solutions when Mr. Creake's curiosity became inconvenient. The formal proceedings concluded with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested such dissolutions were routine aspects of municipal administration. Mrs. Creake's resignation was tendered with monarchical dignity. Mrs. Fallow announced an extended holiday abroad, citing sudden fascination with continental cuisine, while Miss Smeaton remained to assist the bank's auditors in restoring order to the labyrinthine accounts. Morton Flagg found his financial obligations renegotiated with unexpected leniency by the new bank manager, a cautious man who seemed eager to avoid further unfortunate incidents involving local businessmen. Young Dolly Rudd received an anonymous scholarship to Secretarial College, departing Flaxborough with relief at leaving behind its complicated tea services and deceased bankers. Flaxborough resumed its customary rhythms with characteristic resilience, new charitable organizations emerging to replace the dissolved circle with administrative procedures reflecting hard-won wisdom about proper oversight. The Corn Exchange would host another exhibition next spring, and civic virtue would undoubtedly continue, albeit under more transparent circumstances. Inspector Purbright returned to his routine paperwork, though he found himself occasionally contemplating Mr. Creake's extraordinary smile. The banker had died, knowing he had uncovered a scheme of remarkable sophistication, one that demonstrated how easily community respect could provide cover for creative criminality. His final expression had been that of a man who appreciated the ironic elegance of discovering fraud only to become its victim through methods that demonstrated the same organizational skills he had been investigating. In Flaxborough, respectability remained the most effective disguise for criminal activity, while the most obvious explanations continued to conceal the most intricate deceptions. The investigation had concluded with appropriate justice, though it had revealed uncomfortable truths about the ease with which charitable good works could be corrupted when circumstances demanded such transformation. The case files were closed with proper ceremony, joining the accumulated documentation of Flaxborough's remarkable capacity for transforming ordinary citizens into creative criminals when respectability required protection at any cost. The end.